Just a reminder, do check out newslab.org with the Oxford Declaration that Rufus mentioned. He was one of the architects of that, along with our panelists about to come up. We're going to get to that at the end of the session today. Also, the Jordan Center Ipsos poll, all the results with all the charts are there, and we hope that you take a look at that. Our next session here, I think, is going to be very enlightening and invigorating. We've got to moderate it a journalist that I thought I had been following for about 10 years online, but it hasn't been that long. Justin Baragona. He's based in St. Louis. He is currently a reporter for an online site which I read, but I don't know the pronunciation of it.
Zeteo.
Zeteo. I would not, Z-E-T-E-O. I would not have guessed that one. Zeteo. And Justin will explain what that means, I guess.
No.
Who says he won't? And Justin is formerly a pretty high profile online reporter covering a lot about the media at The Independent and The Daily Beast, which makes him a natural to moderate this session. We are very lucky to have with us today Professor Kathy Kiely as the Lee Hills Chair in Press Freedom Studies at the University of Missouri. And she is a veteran reporter and editor who moved into the classroom full-time, taught journalism at the University of New Hampshire, George Washington University, Princeton. She's a longtime trustee of the Daily Princetonian, inaugural Press Freedom Fellow for the National Press Club's nonprofit Journalism Institute. By way of transparency, I'm on the board of that institute. And her reporting and editing career includes stints as a web producer for WAMU, an editor for Bill Moyers, Bloomberg Politics. She covered Congress, national politics for USA Today, headed the Washington bureaus for the Houston Post, the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, White House correspondent for the New York Daily News, general assignment reporter and Washington correspondent for the Pittsburgh Press. Couldn't hold a job for very long at one place. Bachelor's degree from Princeton, master's from the American University, and was a Knight Fellow at Stanford. And in Washington circles, this is very prestigious, a member of the Gridiron Club and serves on the Congressional Standing Committee of Correspondence. We also have with us Dr. Vivian Walker. And transparency, I've been asked to speak to a couple of her classes over the recent years at Georgetown University, where she is an adjunct professor and is also been an executive director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. She is currently the co-president of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. I'm a member of that. Chair of the Foreign Service Journal Editorial Board and a faculty fellow at the Center on Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California. Previously, Professor Walker has taught at Central European University School of Public Policy, the National War College in Washington, D.C., the National Defense College of the UAE. That would be an interesting place to be right now. She was a career Foreign Service officer within the Department of State, rising to the senior rank of Minister Counselor, which as a former Foreign Service officer, I can tell you, I did not get to that rank, and it's a big deal. She served twice as Deputy Chief of Mission in Croatia and Armenia, twice as Office Director, Southeast European Affairs in the Office of Press and Public Diplomacy for Europe, Public Affairs Officer in Kazakhstan, also covering Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, Cultural Affairs Officer in Tunisia, and an Information Officer in Haiti. Dr. Walker graduated from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and earned her doctorate in English Language and Literature from the University of Chicago. So please welcome our next panel.
All right. So we're going to mostly just kind of do this as a very open-ended discussion. I think we discussed that before. So I just want to start with you, Vivian. Just ask about your experience on what we would say fighting, or what you experienced overseas as a diplomat, seeing the disinformation that would go throughout those countries that you've been to, but also what you saw on them fighting that, as well as like propaganda or just outright false news.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here, particularly since, as you've heard from my background, I am probably one of the few non-journalists in the room, non-journalist educationers, practitioners, advocates. I come at these issues from my experience as a diplomat, as representing our country's interests overseas. So that gives me a kind of a different angle on things. And what I think I need to do then is explain, first of all, in a session where we're talking about building trust and legitimacy in journalism, what's the U.S. government got to do with it, right? I think, and so countering disinformation has been a priority, a strategic priority for the U.S. government for a long time. Why? Because disinformation, misinformation, information manipulation has a way of eroding and possibly even compromising a state's legitimacy and power in the global information space. So when the United States government looks at ways to support countries around the world as they move toward the democratic institution building, as they try to strengthen and improve methods of governance. The U.S. government sees that as an investment in long-term security and stability. So bringing it down a little closer to our topic for today, so the focus on disinformation. Well, the public diplomacy, that the portion of the Department of State that focuses on information and influence activities that shape audiences' perceptions in support of national interests, the public diplomacy arm of the Department of State has long been interested in promoting journalism, countering disinformation programs overseas. But it acquired a new intensity in 2014 in the aftermath of Russia's attack on Ukraine, of course, on the ground, but also most spectacularly in the global information space. I don't know if you recall at the time that what prevailed about what was happening in Ukraine was the Russian version of the narrative because Ukraine didn't have a voice in this. So the only story was the Russian version of the story. And so that kicked off a sort of a re-examination within the Department of State of the importance of taking a hard look at this hybrid use of information, the weaponization of information and its consequences. So we launched a series of initiatives, part of which included an intensive focus on media literacy training. The idea is, in combating disinformation, you've got what I would call measures of deterrence and measures of resilience. The measures of deterrence are getting the right story out there, getting the facts out there, providing a counter narrative, and that works in the short term. But the longer term effort really has to be in measures of resilience. How do you build resilience in target audiences to the infection of disinformation? Because disinformation, when it works because it exploits vulnerabilities, fears, inconsistencies, misperceptions, lack of knowledge. So the idea was to focus on the short term, but also on longer term investment in media literacy programs. So we engaged in a number of these, focusing initially in the aftermath, of course, of Russia's attack on Ukraine. We were looking at countries of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But clearly, the threat of disinformation is not limited to what Russia was up to. Disinformation is pervasive. And we began to establish these kinds of programs all over. And I think Kathy will be talking about her experience with some of those as well. So the media literacy programs that we designed I think, had some successes and failures. And what I'd like to do is just go through about 3 or 4 takeaways that that came out of my experience of working on these programs, and maybe takeaways that we might be able to think about applying in a domestic context. The Rolla in the stretch from Rolla to Riga. So when we engage in media literacy programs, the idea was to bring teachers, educators, government officials in countries around the world, strategies to educate local audiences, sensitize them to disinformation, how to assess sources, how to distinguish facts, and these were carried out in a number of ways, but the most successful ways were ones that took these training programs and opportunities to the local level. So the first takeaway was on bringing these training programs and opportunities to the grassroots level and thoroughly understanding your audiences, who you're talking to, why, and what their concerns might be. And the only way to do that is to use local educators, teachers, journalists, community officials, to make them the instructors in the program. They understood the context, they knew the local language, and they would be most credible to the audiences that they were trying to reach. And we would do these in libraries, in schools, in community centers around the country. One of the mistakes that we made, and the reason why I really stress local and contextual, is initially we would bring in top-level experts in public relations or PR from the United States or the UK. They would swan in to the capital. They would dispense a few good ideas about how you reach audiences, and then they'd be gone the next day. That didn't work. So local, contextual, sensitive to the audience. That was the first thing we learned. Then limiting the scope to achievable goals. What are the vulnerabilities? What are the skills that this particular audience or set of audiences needs to know? You design a program, you set your objectives, and then you complete it. The thing that too often happens, speaking candidly and off the record as a recovering, as Jeff Trimble said, a recovering Foreign Service officer, when we launch into these programs with these ideals that disinformation will support support democracy and freedom of expression, and that's great, but you need to scope the program down to an achievable set of goals that can be achieved, and then when the instructors pack up and go away, the way it's been taught is that the basic skills will live on in the audiences, the practices that they've learned. Beware of duplication of effort. Now, this might be may not be a problem in a broader space, but too often we had multiple embassies, the US Embassy, other institutions rushing in with these wonderfully packaged programs, one after the other. It got to be almost oversaturation of here, have a little more media literacy. And the result of that was that it ended up diluting the impact and value of those programs. So a cautionary tale is to target your programs effectively so that you are not competing in a way with other programs that are working on the same issues. Spread the wealth, and that improves your credibility. And this is very difficult to do, given, and we've certainly acknowledged this in what we've talked about earlier, is the degree to which you can keep these initiatives apolitical. And in my experience of, for example, seeing these programs in a country like the Republic of Georgia, which was at the time that I was looking at these programs there, was under a great deal of political pressure, a lot of dissent, a lot of unhappiness with the government. And it was occasionally the media literacy programs we initiated there were discredited because it was from the Americans, and the Americans are on the side of X, or the Americans are against the Russians. So there are ways in which these kinds of programs can, if you're not careful, be exploited by individuals on one end of the spectrum or the other. But so something I think we learned the hard way when we were looking at making these programs happen. But I think my conclusion here is it's how to cultivate a relationship of trust in media. We talk about how to cultivate trust in media. I think we have to think about the relationship of trust. And what I mean is the audience's relationship to media and how we build audiences' trust in themselves to be credible consumers of information. And to make the point that access to objective information is a right. As a citizen, we have a right to that, right? A citizen of any country, but it is also an enormous responsibility, a responsibility placed on the individual. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I just wanted to do a quick follow-up. You talked about being a cautionary tale in Republic of Georgia about American participation, then created, I guess, breeding a distrust. What would be, is maybe a bit too broad of a question, but what would be the solution to that? Would it be trying to bring maybe an American nonprofit rather than a American government participation? Just, I have no.
Actually can tell you a story about that if you want.
Yes.
So I'm with the Missouri School of Journalism, and that's the Rolla in the title. We're really in Columbia, Missouri. Rolla is where our engineering school is, but Steve likes alliteration, so we thought it would be good for the title. And I will say it's nice to be in the same room with my former boss, Walter Hussman, and get another free notebook from him. Thank you, Walter, and your Center for Integrity and News. Walter, the other, Mizzou is famous for being the first school of journalism in the world, actually, founded a year before SPJ was founded. But it's also famous because it's the place where Walter Hussman's parents met. So even though he's a Tar Heel, we can say like our comms department likes to say #MizzouMade. But the founding dean of I'm just going to digress for a second because I think this is important. The founding dean of the School of Journalism at Mizzou wrote a code of ethics called the Journalist Creed. And there's a line in it that says that a public journal is a public trust. And I think more publishers, broadcast owners need to think like that because one of the things we need to do to rebuild trust in journalism is to address the structural issue that Rufus mentioned, and that is that far too many people who are media owners come into a community, take the resources out of it, they're extractive, and they don't build that community. And Walter Hussman has invested in his community and he has invested in local journalism. So good for you. Now, to the Rolla part of this, when Vivian was talking about her story, I was really struck because you might not think, coming from Missouri, that I actually went on one of those State Department trips to Niger, one of the poorest countries on earth. And when the State Department was looking for people to come in and talk about disinformation, and I applied, and I knew Mizzou was going to get this because nobody wanted to go to Niger, right? It's the tough place, and it's kind of scary. And why is it scary? Because this was right after Afghanistan had fallen, and it is one of the new fronts on the war on terror. When you go there, you feel like you're in a Graham Greene novel. The Saudis are at this table, and the Russians are over there, and the Chinese are over here, and everybody's trying to get a piece of the action, and people are weaponizing information to do that. But even though I was confident we were going to get this grant, the State Department put me through my paces and said, what do you know about Niger? And I said, well, it's actually a lot like Missouri. I said, you have vast swaths of the country where you have no local media. And people are relying, in our case in Missouri, on Facebook, and Niger, WhatsApp, which is another Mark Zuckerberg special. What could possibly go wrong? And those have become, social media has become a vector for disinformation. Certainly, I don't believe Mark Zuckerberg started out wanting it to be that way, but it has become a vector for disinformation because talking about confirmation bias, as Rufus did, it has put confirmation bias on steroids. Because we're talking about AI as though it's this new thing.
Yeah.
But AI has been in your life for decades. And the way it has been in your life is by curating your social media feed. And so not only are we now able to choose a news source that gives us information and news that we agree with, AI is working behind the scenes to amplify your confirmation bias. Because how does Mark Zuckerberg make money, or how does Google make money? They make money by getting advertisers. How do advertisers get convinced to buy space? Well, look at the audience engagement. Look at how many people are spending time on our site and how much time they're spending time on our site. It's a recipe for never changing your mind, because what's happening is behind the scenes, AI is tailoring your news feed to give you news that won't make you uncomfortable. Go out and do a search. If you're conservative and you live in the country and you subscribe to, I don't know, Guns and Gardens, and you have a friend, and if you don't, you should, who lives in a big city and subscribes to the New Yorker and listens to NPR, I want you to go and do the same search and see what results you get. And see if there's not a filter bubble. So these are the structural things that we have to deal with to get past this. So when I went to Niger, I went as an American, and knowing that, I was walking into this stew of disinformation where the Russians had quite a head start. And so I'm talking to a group of journalists. And the journalists, by the way, in Niger were wonderful. They were fantastic. But they're skeptical of Americans, because they said, well, wait a minute, how are you different from Vladimir Putin? We've messed around. We've had coups in Iran. Let's face it. Yeah. What makes you different? What makes you so much better? And so we went back and forth. First of all, I brought the title page from a court case where I was the lead plaintiff with the National Press Club Journalism Institute suing the Department of Homeland Security in a case involving asylum for journalists. So I said, look, I'm suing the government, and yet they brought me here. But then we went back and forth, and this one journalist in particular was really skeptical. And he said, well, tell me, what's so much better about the United States? And what about, why are you different from Vladimir Putin? And I looked at him and I said, okay, which country would you rather be a reporter in? And the room burst into laughter. So our strength has got to be our willingness to take criticism, and our willingness to hear the criticism, hear the other side of the story. And I think that has, for a long time, been the strength of the American people, that we are willing to hear the bad stuff about ourselves. And by the way, we will tell you ourselves what mistakes we've made. And so I think that is the strength that any journal has to go into its public. Are we willing to tell you we've made a mistake. When people ask me, like, what is a credible news source? I say, do they have corrections?
Mhm.
Because to err is human, but to correct is professional.
Yes.
I like that.
And if you are dealing with a publication that will admit its errors, or a broadcast entity, whatever it is, that's telling you they care about their reputations and they care about the reputations of the people they cover, meaning they care about their community. And that's a public trust.
So something I noticed in the last conversation, we talked about how the loss of a local connection breeds mistrust among the population in a locality, whether it's statewide or it drills down into small town city. One thing I had noticed, I just, bringing up those stats is, we're going to bring this over into, from overseas into here is, the number of news desert counties rose to 213 in 2025. That means that they don't have any newspaper in that entire county. That there is now about 50 million Americans who have limited to no access to local news. And that keeps growing. I mean, at this point, in terms of local newspaper closures, we're at more than 2 a week. And now, what fills that vacuum? And what I was going to say is what's now been called pink slime journalism. News outlets that, pretend to be local newspapers, filling that void. So how do we combat that?
Well, I think, and this gets to a point that Vivian made earlier, I think one of the things we have to do, and I really like Dr. Jordan's line about journalists being lifelong educators.
Yeah.
One of the things we have to, we've always educated the public about the issues, the debates, the issues of the day. We have to educate the public as to how we do our jobs. Not just so we can tell them, you should trust me because look how hard I work or how careful I am, but because we want to give the public the skills to help them discern the difference between fact-based, primary sourced, reported public service news, journalism, and propaganda. And so I think, Dean Andrea said earlier, and we get the same questions at Mizzou. I mean, what are the careers for my kids? There has never been a better time to be a journalist because the challenge is so great. I tell my students, this is your moonshot. Being able to take this technology and make it work for the good instead of the bad. This is, you guys have to figure this out. So and the other thing is, I think there's no better time to be a journalism educator because our audience is not just the students who are enrolled in our classes. Our audience should be the whole world. We need to teach everybody a little bit about journalism 101, how to verify sources, how to build trust. And I think these media literacy, these initiatives that we've started overseas really need to come right back home. And we took one that Vivian, I know, has talked to me about working with IREX in the Ukraine. I brought the IREX people to Columbia, Missouri. And we incubated a program for our public schools. We are starting to teach media literacy in middle school. And maybe we should go to grade school.
But even with media literacy programs, trying to, start earlier, trying to get them to discern what is real information, real news compared to propaganda, disinformation, clickbait, whatever you want to call it. What is the solution to when there is no local news outlet is really where I think we need to come down to. And even on many of the news outlets that are in these local cities, counties, towns, they've been consolidated into bigger conglomerations and stripped for parts almost.
Yeah.
How do we address that? That seems to be the big problem here,
Well, I mean,
how do we reverse the trend?
well, I think we're seeing some signs of hope here.
Yeah.
Our colleagues from Birmingham and Louisiana who there are, I mean, the thing to me is no matter how, I think people have in my time in the business, media has become to some people this means of making money. And of course, everybody needs to profit. But really, you shouldn't go into the media business to make money. You should go into the media business because you want to do public service. And there are people, they're probably not making tons of money, but you can still, you may not be able to print a newspaper, but you can still get news online that is reliable and trustworthy and hits all the marks that integrity in journalism is all about. I think this is a hopeful time because I think the same technology that has disrupted the media ecosystem can be used to rebuild it if we seize it. We have to own it though.
It'd almost be,
Yeah, I was going to jump on that and then step back to comment on a couple of other things. Yes, I think taking ownership of the technology is key. And going back to the example of public diplomacy and projecting our identity and our interests globally, one of the challenges has been that every evolution in communication technology has created a threat before it then also turns into an opportunity. And let me give you an example from the public diplomacy. So back in 1964, Edward R. Murrow, the great Edward R. Murrow, yes, who was also at the time the director of the standalone U.S. Information Agency. We had a standalone agency for public diplomacy, which was folded in 1999 because we had won the war of the ideas. Well, that's a separate conversation. But in any case, so Edward R. Murrow, as director of the U.S. Information Agency, was very worried about the state of information. He was worried about information that was traveling so quickly and getting to audiences without filters and creating opportunities for mis and disinformation that represented a significant threat to the United States' ability to convey its interests in the public space. Anyone guess what that technology was?
Television.
Television,
Yeah.
right? I tell this to my students and they look at me like, what was it? What was that you called it? But the idea is that it was a threat. And what did the U.S. Information Agency do? It created its own satellite broadcasting system so that we would produce programming in Washington, beam it out around the world, multiple languages, on everything from news and information, English language teaching. And it was the job of the poor public affairs officer, me, for example, in Kazakhstan. I had to worry about my satellite dish on top of my building as much as I had to worry about my talking points for the ambassador, right? Because that thing blew down in one of those winds off the steppe. I was toast. So we recorded these programs in Russian. We recorded them on VCRs and audio cassettes, and we gave them to drivers, and they drove them around to radio stations and television stations around the country. That was cutting edge outreach and technology, and that was taking a technology that was a threat and turning it into an opportunity, and there are multiple examples of that. But I want to go back to a couple other things you said, Kathy, that really resonated with me. And one was your example of talking to the journalists in Niger, and your point about our ability to be honest and critical about our own shortcomings, and that transparency about who we are as a country, the things that work for us, but the things where we have made mistakes has been one of our most powerful sources of credibility. And going back to the earlier days of the U.S. Information Agency, one of the things I think they did quite well was to talk about civil rights movement overseas. We had a number of programs, the Jazz Ambassadors program, there were VOA programs, and we would send civil rights experts, educators, leaders across the world to talk about the experience, and to talk about the experience not only as in this is how the United States does it, but this is where we failed. This is where we've had problems. And no, the expectation is not that you do it our way, but the expectation was, by sending these educators out there, was to be able to start a conversation in those countries and in those societies about the issues. And that was a powerful source of credibility. The more that we can expose our own inadequacies at the same time we talk about what works, the better we're off. And so the Department of State has this international visitor program, which would bring visitors of any number of fields to the state for 3 or 4 weeks of travel exposure. And the really great thing about these programs was they, whether it was journalism training or small business enterprise or law enforcement, the full range, they would show the foreign visitors what worked. But to the shock of so many of the people that I sent on these programs, they talked about the things that didn't. And so when I would debrief my participants as they came back from the United States, I'd say, all right, so what was it? What'd you take from this? And, they said, well, okay, yeah, we learned a little bit about this and we got some ideas about that and it was great, but you talk about the things where you failed. That's powerful. And so I think that speaks to the point that you made. The other point that I wanted to make really quickly was this Learn to Discern program, and it's that the responsibility and the gift of discernment. And I think that's what that it is important to teach people how to discern, but also to take responsibility for the effort to identify news sources. And I often, as a public diplomacy officer, face the charge as a spokesperson somewhere, like, you know what, all you're doing is disseminating propaganda about your country. And I would say, okay, fair enough. I'm here in my position as a spokesperson, as an advocate. I do tell you about my country and its interests. But what distinguishes public diplomacy from propaganda, in my view, is that it was a two-way street. It's here are our views, our principles, our ideas. Tell us what you think. Or here are our principles, our ideas, our values. Choose or not choose. Make your own decisions. Discern what in our policies they make sense to you. What doesn't make sense to you, and wherever you come out is fine. And I think that agency is something that's really critical.
I want to say something specific about the Learn to Discern program, which was piloted by IREX, this organization that has been defunded largely by the current administration. But what was I thought what their magic sauce was, and this I think is something that any news media organization, any journalism program has to think about adopting. What made this program powerful is they created small groups of people who were kind of their own little reality checks in a community, and to talk about what is legitimate news, what is not. And these local experts that they found were not necessarily the editor of the local newspaper, if one exists, or the mayor of the town. They were the lady who ran the book club at the local church, or the guy who coached the softball team. These are people who have influence in their own communities, and who have people who respect them and follow them. And what IREX did was train those people on how to understand the ins and outs of who owns the media and what impact does that have, or how is this story sourced. and they would then share it with their communities. But I think when I say we need to educate about how we do our jobs, I think it's incumbent upon all of us who are involved in the media to create these kind of programs within our own communities so that we can catalyze them, but we're not the ones who are leading the discussion.
Yeah. I guess on one end, I would say, would we treat and I think this always has to be started at the local level.
Absolutely.
Would we want to treat local media almost as like a public utility? That each city, should have a local paper that continues to run, that has journalists that cover what's going on in that community, whether it be civic affairs, local politics, sports, arts and entertainment, and it needs to be maintained. But the issue is, how do we do that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot more conversation and it makes people very uncomfortable about public information being a public good, and public goods are generally subsidized. I mean, I think you heard Dr. Jordan had some pretty provocative ideas about how to raise money from the social media, but I also almost wonder if social media should be regulated like a public utility, and have some accountability to people. But I think in terms of should there be a public revenue stream is what we're really talking about, to support local journalism. And the stopper of that is always, well, that would mean you'd be beholden. And sadly, there are two fantastic examples of public money funding First Amendment journalism in this country that are being undermined right now. And one of those is Voice of America, and the other is the Stars and Stripes newspaper. And these are First Amendment news operations that are in many ways, in my opinion, the most valuable weapon in America's arsenal, more than the B-52 bombers, or because there are values. And when people, like you say, when people from other countries say, wait, what? You're funding a newspaper that can criticize the Pentagon? What?
Yeah.
And because, as Dwight D. Eisenhower, the then Supreme Allied Commander, said to General Patton when he wanted to court-martial Bill Malden for putting two scruffy GIs, Joe and Willie, in Stars and Stripes, General Eisenhower said, "That is the troops' newspaper, and we shall not interfere." Unfortunately, we are backing off. And those are two great models because, yes, publicly funded, but by the way, that's not Pete Hegseth's money. It's not Marco Rubio's money funding VOA. It is your money and my money. And you, the taxpayers, have to decide, do we want First Amendment news operations funded with our money, or do we want propaganda? It's our money. And so how do you want that money spent? And so we can sit here and talk all we want as members of the media or members of the diplomatic corps, but it's really up to you all, to make a decision about how do we want our money spent? Do we want our tax dollars to go so that we have a local news outlet? And how are we going to protect that news outlet from interference by politicians? And I think it can be done. For many, many, many years, Stars and Stripes has done it. And if Congress would do its job, I think Stars and Stripes would maintain its independence, as would VOA.
Initially, I was going to open it up to questions, but I see that we're only 2 minutes left. So I just wanted to see if Vivian, if you had any final words here.
Well, I of course want to second Kathy's shout out to Voice of America and to the international broadcasting services in general, because when we have Voice of America, But we also support the grantee organizations like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, Al-Hura. These platforms were extraordinary in their ability to not only provide context and information about the United States, that's an important piece of it, and to advocate in editorial context for US policy, but bringing access to information to communities and people around the world who were otherwise cut off from that information, isolated from it, protected behind firewalls. This was an important resource, not just for the American people and for our own credibility. These platforms served as a resource for the rest of the world. And I think in shuttering USAGM, in significantly cutting public diplomacy programs, in the multiple initiatives that this administration has taken to stifle our voices and our representation, it is nothing short of, and I'm put my War College hat on, it is a form of information disarmament that we've created here. And I think it's dangerous.
Well, I want to thank both of you guys for a very illuminating and robust discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin, Vivian, and Kathy. Next time, we're going to have you up here for 2 hours to answer lots of questions, so just be prepared.